There is a fine line between good and evil. Each experiment peels back the illusion of moral certainty. They show how easily decency fractures under pressure, how identity erodes, and how terrifyingly elastic the human psyche can be. The Milgram Obedience Experiment. It was 1961. Adolf Eichmann, one of the architects of the Holocaust, had just been captured and put on trial. The world watched in horror as he defended himself with a simple phrase, "I was just following orders." It was a defense that chilled the public and intrigued a psychologist named Stanley Milgram. He wanted to understand how far obedience could go. Could ordinary people commit acts of cruelty simply because an authority told them to? So he designed an experiment. Participants were brought into a Yale laboratory. They were told it was a study on memory and learning. One participant would be the teacher, and the other, actually a trained actor, would be the learner. The teacher's job was simple. Read a series of word pairs to the learner. If the learner got it wrong, they would be given an electric shock. With each mistake, the voltage would increase. 15 volts, then 30, then 150, then 300. All the way to 450 volts, labelled XXX, danger, severe shock. As the shocks increased, the learner, who was in on the experiment, began to scream in pain. "I have a heart condition," he cried. "Let me out of here." Then silence. The participant, the real subject, would often hesitate, tremble, sweat. They'd turn to the experimenter and ask if they should stop, but the man in the lab coat would calmly reply, "Please continue. The experiment requires that you continue. You have no other choice. You must go on." And they did. 65% of participants administered the final 450-volt shock, fully believing they may have killed a man. These were not sadists. They were teachers, salesmen, engineers, fathers, and yet the overwhelming majority obeyed. Why? Because the situation was engineered for obedience. The lab coat symbolized authority. The institutional setting conferred legitimacy. The reassurances diffused responsibility. And the gradual escalation, 15 volts at a time, lulled people into complicity. Milgram's study shattered the myth of moral steadfastness. It revealed that, under the right conditions, anyone is capable of becoming the hand that flips the switch. The lesson wasn't just about obedience. It was about self-deception. People told themselves they weren't responsible, that they were just helping science, that someone else would take the blame. This is how ordinary people become instruments of harm, not because they want to hurt, but because they don't want to resist, because authority cloaks itself in rationality, because dissent is uncomfortable. So I ask you now, if you were the teacher, if you were in that cold Yale laboratory, would you have stopped, or would you have gone all the way? The Stanford Prison Experiment. August 14th, 1971, Palo Alto, California. A team of volunteers is arrested, booked, fingerprinted, blindfolded, and taken to a basement prison beneath Stanford University. They haven't committed any crimes. They're participants in an experiment. Psychologist Philip Zimbardo wanted to explore what happens when people are placed into rigid roles of power and powerlessness. So he selected 24 college students, mentally healthy, stable, well-adjusted, and randomly assigned them to be either guards or prisoners. The transformation was instant. Guards were given uniforms, sunglasses, and batons. Prisoners wore smocks and numbers instead of names. The basement was converted into a realistic prison. Cells, solitary confinement, strip searches, and then the roles began to consume them. On day 1, the guards were awkward, unsure how to assert control. By day 2, they were forcing prisoners to do push-ups, denying them food, making them clean toilets with their bare hands. By day 4, the humiliation turned sadistic. Prisoners were stripped naked, deprived of sleep, locked in solitary for minor offences. Some guards began inventing arbitrary punishments for fun. Some prisoners began breaking down, crying, shouting, dissociating. Zimbardo, acting as the prison superintendent, didn't intervene. He had become part of the system. It took an outsider, psychologist Christina Maslach, to confront him and say, "This is wrong. You need to stop." The study, intended to last 2 weeks, was terminated on day 6. What shocked the world was not just the cruelty, but the speed. These were normal young men, and yet within days they had absorbed their roles so deeply that morality evaporated. The Stanford prison experiment revealed that cruelty is not always born from evil intentions. Sometimes it's born from roles, from uniforms, from systems that reward compliance and punish resistance. We like to believe our identity is fixed, that no situation could make us forget who we are. But this study proved otherwise. The prison wasn't real, but the effects were. The guards didn't become monsters, they became reflections of the power they were handed. And the prisoners didn't lose their freedom, they lost their sense of self. So ask yourself, if you were randomly assigned a role in that basement, would you have resisted, or would you have become someone you no longer recognized? The monster study. In 1939, a well-intentioned but devastatingly misguided psychological experiment took place at the University of Iowa, led by speech pathologist Wendell Johnson and his graduate student Mary Tudor. The goal? To explore the roots of stuttering, whether it was an inborn defect or a learned behavior triggered by external influence. But what happened instead became one of the darkest blemishes on the field of speech therapy and psychological experimentation. The study, later dubbed the Monster Study by peers horrified by its ethical violations, involved 22 orphaned children. These were vulnerable kids already navigating life without parental support or emotional security. Half of them were told they had excellent speech and were praised for it. The other half, the experimental group, were told the exact opposite. They were harshly criticized, told they spoke poorly, and that their speech was full of flaws even when it wasn't. They were made to feel broken. The result? Many of the children in the negative feedback group, who had originally spoken perfectly well, began developing signs of speech hesitation, self-consciousness, and in some cases, long-term speech problems that lasted for years. Their sense of self was shattered, not because of any defect, but because someone told them they were flawed, again and again, in a voice of authority. What this reveals is chilling. A child's psyche is malleable, impressionable, and acutely sensitive to the voice of authority. You don't need violence to hurt someone. Sometimes, all it takes is a consistent suggestion that something is wrong with them. That is enough to rewire their perception of themselves. That is enough to damage them. This study reminds us that words carry psychological weight. Labels, especially from authority figures, parents, teachers, mentors, can shape a person's inner monologue for life. If you grew up with constant criticism or felt like your natural self was too much or not enough, you might still carry the invisible residue of that conditioning. The monster study didn't involve whips or cages. It used something far more available, language. And in doing so, it showed us that psychological violence can be just as cruel, just as lasting, and far more difficult to detect than the physical kind. So ask yourself, what were you told as a child that you still believe today? Who told you you weren't enough? And more importantly, are they still living in your head, rent-free? The Little Albert Experiment. In 1920, John B. Watson, a pioneer of behaviorism, conducted a psychological experiment that would become both infamous and foundational to our understanding of conditioned fear. The subject? A 9-month-old baby named Albert. Watson and his assistant Rosalie Rayner set out to prove that emotions could be conditioned just like physical responses. To do this, they first exposed little Albert to a series of animals and objects: a white rat, a rabbit, a dog, a monkey, even burning newspapers. At first, Albert showed no signs of fear. He played with the animals and reached out to touch them, showing the natural curiosity of a child. Then, the experiment turned dark. Every time Albert reached for the white rat, Watson would strike a steel bar with a hammer behind him, producing a loud, terrifying noise. After several repetitions, Albert began to associate the sight of the rat with the noise. Eventually he would cry or crawl away at just the sight of the rat, even with no sound. But it didn't stop there. Albert's fear generalized. He became afraid of other furry objects, rabbits, dogs, even a Santa Claus mask. This experiment revealed something disturbing and profound. Fear is not always instinctive. It can be created. And once it is, it can spread. A single traumatic experience, if reinforced enough, can infect a person's worldview, creating fear associations with things that were once neutral or even comforting. Think about your own fears. How many of them come from moments you don't even consciously remember? How many of them were taught, not inherited? How many of them are echoes of someone else's pain, passed down through your childhood or culture? The Little Albert experiment is a grim reminder of how fragile the human mind is during early development. It's also a metaphor for adulthood. Many of us are still reacting to white rats, symbols of things that once hurt us, even if the original source of the trauma is long gone. And perhaps most tragically, no one knows what happened to little Albert. He was never desensitized, never deconditioned. He was simply allowed to grow up with this newly programmed fear, the scars of someone else's scientific ambitions stitched into his nervous system. The Bystander Effect, the murder of Kitty Genovese. It was the early hours of March 13th, 1964. In the quiet neighbourhood of Kew Gardens, Queens, a 28-year-old woman named Kitty Genovese was walking home from work when she was brutally attacked. The assault lasted for over half an hour. She was stabbed multiple times, screamed for help, and staggered to escape her attacker, only to be found and stabbed again. The tragedy of her death was compounded by what came after. Reports claimed that 38 witnesses had seen or heard parts of the attack, and none of them intervened. This shocking detail gripped the nation, not just because of the crime itself, but because of what it revealed about the psychology of society. How could so many people, hearing her screams, do nothing? Were they evil? Cowardly? Or was something deeper going on? Something quietly terrifying about how humans behave in groups? This became the basis for what psychologists Bibb Latani and John Darley would coin as the bystander effect. The idea is as chilling as it is simple. The more people there are present in an emergency, the less likely any one individual is to intervene. Why? Because we assume someone else will do it? It's called diffusion of responsibility. To test this, Latani and Darley created a series of experiments. In one of the most famous, participants were told they'd be discussing personal issues over intercom with others in different rooms. At some point during the session, one of the voices began to simulate a seizure, gasping, struggling to speak, crying for help. The participant believed they were the only one hearing it, or one of several. The results were telling. When participants thought they were the only witness, 85% took action. But when they thought others could hear it too, only 31% intervened. It wasn't that people didn't care, it was that they assumed someone else would. The more people, the less urgent the responsibility felt. This effect isn't just theoretical, it happens in real life, in subway stations, at public pools, on city streets. Tragedies unfold not because we are individually cruel, but because we are socially paralysed, caught in a web of silence and uncertainty, looking to others for permission to care. There's a certain horror in realising that you might not act, not because you lack empathy, but because your mind is wired to scan others for cues, and if others look passive, you do too. What makes this even more disturbing is how often we rationalise our inaction. We assume the scream was a prank, that someone else already called the police, that we don't know the full context, so we scroll past, walk faster, close the window, move on. And in doing so, we reveal a darker side of humanity, the way good people can become complicit in evil simply by doing nothing. But perhaps what's most unsettling isn't that this happens to strangers, it's that it can happen to us. You may think, I would never just watch. But in a crowd, in a crisis, when adrenaline is high and responsibility feels shared, would you really? This is why the story of Kitty Genovese still lingers, not just because of her death, but because it forces us to ask a painful question. When the moment comes, will I act, or will I wait for someone else to? The Blue Eyes, Brown Eyes experiment. The day after Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in 1968, a third-grade teacher named Jane Elliott decided to give her all-white class in rural Iowa a lesson they would never forget. It wasn't from a textbook. It wasn't part of the curriculum. It was a live psychological experiment, one that would come to define how discrimination is taught, felt, and internalized. She stood in front of her class and told the children that blue-eyed people were superior, smarter, cleaner, more honest, more deserving. Brown-eyed children, on the other hand, were dirty, lazy, dumb, not to be trusted, and for that day they would be treated accordingly. What followed was astonishing. Almost immediately, the blue-eyed children began to adopt their new superior status. They acted more confident. They taunted the brown-eyed kids. They excluded them at lunch and on the playground. Jane Elliott, playing her role to the fullest, enforced the division, giving blue-eyed students extra privileges and punishing brown-eyed ones more harshly for the same infractions. The brown-eyed children became meek and insecure. Their academic performance dropped within hours. Their posture changed. Their self-worth began to deteriorate, simply because someone told them they were less. The next day, Elliott reversed the roles. Now brown-eyed kids were the superior ones, and the behavior flipped. The newly superior children acted emboldened. The inferior ones shrank. What Elliott demonstrated was raw, powerful, and deeply uncomfortable. How easy it is to create prejudice. How quickly human beings, even innocent children, will fall into hierarchies, us versus them, when given the slightest push. And how deeply identity and self-worth are shaped by external judgment. This wasn't just a classroom experiment. It was a reflection of real life, of racism, of caste systems, of discrimination based on gender, language, class, accent, religion, or appearance. Elliott had shown that hatred could be manufactured, and more chillingly, that the victims of it would internalize the message. Even years later, when her former students were interviewed as adults, they remembered the day vividly. Some had broken down crying during the experiment. Others had realized for the first time what it meant to be treated as less than. It was a mirror held up to society, and it cut deep. Elliott herself became a controversial figure. Many parents were outraged. She received hate mail for traumatizing children, but she insisted they were only traumatized because they were exposed to the real pain of what discrimination feels like. The takeaway is haunting. We're not born to hate, but we're frighteningly easy to condition, and once conditioned, we act it out, even if it means hurting someone else. This experiment wasn't done in a prison. It wasn't funded by a government. It was carried out in a normal classroom, and that makes it even more powerful, because it suggests that evil, the kind we associate with war, genocide, or oppression, doesn't have to be taught explicitly. It only needs a system, a story, and someone to enforce it. And in that story, we're all capable of playing a role, whether as the dominant, the oppressed, or the bystander who says nothing. The Robbers Cave Experiment. In the summer of 1954, a quiet camp in Robbers Cave State Park, Oklahoma, became the backdrop for one of the most telling demonstrations of how quickly humans can descend into tribalism, hatred, and violence, not out of necessity but through careful orchestration. It was a setup, a perfectly designed psychological trap. At the heart of it was social psychologist Muzafer Sherif, a man who wanted to prove that conflict isn't born from deep hatred, but from circumstance. His hypothesis: if you simply divide people into groups and give them opposing goals, they will turn on each other, not because of who they are, but because of where the incentives lie. Sherif recruited 22 young boys, all white, Protestant, middle class, well-adjusted, and split them into two groups without each other's knowledge. For the first week, each group formed bonds on its own. They camped, played, explored, and created strong in-group identities. They even named themselves. One group became the Eagles, the other the Rattlers. Flags were drawn, songs were made, roles emerged, leaders rose. Only then were the groups introduced, and conflict was slowly engineered. Sherif created a tournament, tug of war, baseball, treasure hunts. The reward: a shiny trophy and bragging rights. The cost: everything else. Each win meant the other group lost, and with each loss came bitterness. What started as competition quickly devolved into outright hostility. Boys burned each other's flags. They raided each other's cabins. Fights broke out. Stones were thrown. Food fights turned to sabotage. These were not children raised in violent households or broken communities. These were normal kids, in a peaceful setting, manipulated into seeing the other as the enemy. All it took was separation, a name, a symbol, and a reason to fight. What's chilling is how easily they internalized the roles. Once the us versus them narrative took hold, empathy evaporated. They dehumanized the other side. The boys didn't just compete, they hated, and they were willing to escalate that hatred without much prompting. But Sheriff didn't stop there. He wanted to see how to reverse it. After letting the conflict reach a boiling point, he introduced shared challenges that neither group could solve alone. A broken water supply, a stalled truck that needed pulling. Situations where cooperation was the only solution. Slowly, tensions dissolved. Working together, the boys rehumanized each other. The same kids who had thrown rocks were now sharing meals and helping each other back to camp. The takeaway? Human divisions are not rooted in evil, they're engineered. We are tribal by design, yes, but it's not destiny. Tribes form wherever there's identity. Conflict forms wherever that identity is threatened or challenged. The Robber's Cave experiment reveals a painful truth. We're not as civilized as we think. Strip away comfort, introduce scarcity or rivalry, and even children will choose aggression. This mirrors the adult world. Nationalism, politics, religion, sports, workplace cliques. In every sphere of life, our instincts push us toward in-group loyalty and out-group suspicion. Propaganda, fear, and competition fuel the fire. And the scariest part? Most people don't realize it's happening. Sheriff's work forces us to confront our own susceptibility. How often do we find ourselves rooting for our side, even when the stakes are meaningless? How quickly do we accept narratives about the others without questioning who benefits from the conflict? The experiment ended with peace, but it left an unsettling legacy. If hatred can be manufactured so easily, then so can war, so can oppression, and those in power, governments, corporations, media, understand this all too well. Are the divisions you feel today truly your own, or were they handed to you? Project MKUltra. The darkest psychological experiment of all may not have taken place in a lab or under ethical oversight. It happened in secret rooms, hidden files, and within the shadows of power. Project MKUltra was the CIA's mind control program, launched in the 1950s, aimed at mastering psychological manipulation. The Cold War had ignited fears that enemies might already be using hypnosis, drugs, or other means to control minds. So the US decided to get ahead, no matter the cost. What followed was a horrific descent into human experimentation. Over 80 institutions were involved, universities, hospitals, and prisons. The subjects, often unknowing civilians. People were dosed with LSD without their consent, locked in sensory deprivation chambers, hypnotized, and psychologically broken down. Some were given drugs for 77 days straight. Others were kept in induced comas. There were attempts to erase memories, reprogram personalities, and reduce people to blank slates. One of the most infamous cases involved Frank Olson, a CIA scientist who began having psychological breakdowns after being unknowingly dosed with LSD by his own colleagues. Days later, he fell to his death from a New York hotel window, officially ruled a suicide. Years later, his family uncovered evidence suggesting he may have been pushed. The terrifying truth about MKUltra is that it was real. It wasn't science fiction or dystopian fantasy. It happened, and it shattered the boundary between research and torture, intelligence and inhumanity. Psychologically, it raises disturbing questions. How far will institutions go when secrecy justifies morality? What happens when ethical oversight disappears? When the line between experiment and weapon blurs? MKUltra reminds us that psychology, like any science, is a tool. In the wrong hands, it becomes something monstrous. To this day, many MKUltra documents remain classified, and the full extent of the program may never be known. But its existence is a warning. When fear drives research and power goes unchecked, the human mind becomes the battlefield. The Landis facial expressions experiment. In 1924, a psychology student named Carney Landis at the University of Minnesota wanted to answer a simple question. Do all humans make the same facial expressions in response to certain emotions? It was a scientific curiosity. But what he did to explore it was grotesque. Landis gathered students and smeared painted lines on their faces to better track muscle movement. He exposed them to a series of intense, disturbing stimuli. They were made to smell ammonia, watch pornographic images, listen to explosive noises. Photographs were taken at each stage to study their facial reactions, but it didn't stop there. For the climax of the experiment, participants were shown a live decapitation of a rat. They were handed a knife and instructed to do it themselves. Some refused, others complied, many broke down crying, and yet, all of it, the horror, the revulsion, the emotional trauma was recorded for science. And what did Landis discover? That facial expressions are highly variable, not universal as he'd hoped to prove. The experiment was a failure, scientifically. But it revealed something far deeper, that under the right conditions people will override their instincts, morality and sanity just to comply. The real lesson of the Landis experiment wasn't about facial expressions. It was about authority, pressure, and the ease with which people can be coerced into violating their own values. The participants were college students, young, intelligent, modern, yet faced with institutional expectation and a lab coat, many did something they never would have imagined, killing a living creature for data. Today it stands as a haunting example of how the pursuit of knowledge, when untethered from ethics, can dehumanize both the subject and the scientist. The Good Samaritan Study. In 1973 at Princeton Theological Seminary, a place dedicated to shaping future ministers, pastors and moral leaders, two researchers, John Darley and Daniel Batson, launched an experiment that would challenge the very idea of what it means to be a good person. Inspired by the biblical story of the Good Samaritan, they wanted to explore a pressing question. Why do people often fail to help others in need, even when morality is central to their identity? And perhaps more chillingly, could something as trivial as time pressure make compassion disappear? The setup was deceptively simple. Seminary students were asked to walk to a nearby building to deliver a short speech. Half were assigned to speak on a neutral topic. The other half were asked to give a talk on, ironically, the story of the Good Samaritan itself. The researchers told some students they were late and had to rush. Others were told they had just enough time, and some were told they had extra time to spare. But here was the catch. Along the path to the next building, the students encountered a man slumped in a doorway, coughing, groaning, clearly in distress. He was part of the experiment. The question was simple. Who would stop to help? The results were sobering. You might think the students talking about the Good Samaritan would be the most likely to act with compassion. After all, they had just immersed themselves in a tale about mercy. But that wasn't what determined their behaviour. It wasn't the topic. It wasn't their belief system. It wasn't their training and ethics. The single biggest factor, whether they were in a hurry. Of those told they were late, only 10% stopped to help. Of those who had time, nearly 63% offered assistance. It didn't matter that these were aspiring religious leaders. The immediacy of their own schedule, the stress of being late, overrode their moral instincts. One student even stepped over the groaning man to get to his speech on the Good Samaritan. Darley and Batson's study reveals something profoundly uncomfortable. We are not as guided by our values as we like to believe. Circumstances, especially urgency, stress or preoccupation, can turn good people into indifferent bystanders. We often tell ourselves that if we saw someone in need, we'd help. But the truth is, when placed under time pressure, many of us become blind to suffering. It's not because we're evil, but because our attention narrows. We become absorbed in our task, our deadlines, our inner world, and in that moment, morality gets outsourced to convenience. This experiment echoes through every city sidewalk, every busy train station, every workplace where someone is struggling silently. How often have we walked past someone who needed help because we were late, because we were in a rush, or mentally elsewhere? The Good Samaritan study forces us to ask an unsettling question. Are we only kind when it's convenient? And if so, how fragile is our compassion really? Albert Bandura's Bobo doll experiment. In 1961, psychologist Albert Bandura conducted a deceptively simple experiment that would ignite a revolution in psychology, education, parenting, and media ethics. His work didn't just explore how children learn, it revealed how easily aggression can be absorbed, mimicked, and normalized. The Bobo doll experiment exposed a psychological truth many refuse to admit. We become what we watch. Bandura wanted to test the theory of observational learning, the idea that people, especially children, don't need to be directly punished or rewarded to learn behaviours. They simply need to see someone else doing it. In other words, we are shaped not just by what happens to us, but by what we witness. The study's setup was straightforward, almost innocent. Children between the ages of 3 and 6 were brought into a room where they watched an adult interact with a large inflatable clown doll known as Bobo. But what they witnessed depended on which group they were in. In the first group, the children saw an adult acting aggressively toward the doll, hitting it, kicking it, throwing it across the room, and even shouting violent phrases like, "Sock him in the nose!" In the second group, the adult played calmly and non-aggressively. A third group, the control, saw no model at all. Later, the children were left alone in a room with toys, including the Bobo doll. What happened next was startling. The children who had observed the aggressive adult were significantly more likely to imitate the exact behaviours they had seen, hitting, kicking, and shouting at the doll. Some even went beyond what the adult had modelled, inventing new ways to attack the doll. The children who saw non-aggressive behaviour were far less violent, and those in the control group showed the least aggression overall. What Bandura had demonstrated was as revolutionary as it was disturbing. Children learn violence not only by experiencing it, but by watching it. And the imitation is not passive, it is active, animated, and often escalated. This might seem obvious today, in a world hyper-aware of the effects of media and role models. But at the time, the belief that children were blank slates or purely rational learners was deeply ingrained. Bandura's experiment shattered that illusion. But the implications didn't stop at childhood. Bandura's later work extended the theory of observational learning into adulthood, into how we internalize social norms, authority, aggression, and even apathy. From movies and video games to parental conflict and peer dynamics, we absorb more from our environment than we realize. And here's where the chilling depth of the experiment begins to emerge. If aggression is learned so effortlessly, through just a few minutes of exposure, then how many microaggressions, toxic interactions, or violent displays have we absorbed without even realizing it? It's not just about violence in media. It's about what kind of behavior is modeled to us daily, in homes, schools, relationships, workplaces, and online. When children see adults yelling during conflict, or using manipulation, or degrading others, they don't just judge those actions, they internalize them. Even more dangerously, Bandura found that if the adult model was rewarded for aggression, children were more likely to imitate them. If the model was punished, the aggression was less likely to be copied. This introduced the concept of vicarious reinforcement. We don't even need to experience consequences firsthand to learn. We just watch how others are treated. In a world saturated with influencers, media, and algorithms, this concept has never been more relevant. We model the behaviours we see elevated. When cruelty, arrogance, or aggression are rewarded with attention or status, they become blueprints for identity, especially in young, developing minds. The Bobo doll experiment was the beginning of a new psychological reality. Humans are mirrors, and those mirrors reflect back what they're shown, sometimes without filter, without thought, and without moral reasoning. So the real question Bandura left us with is this: who, or what, are you modelling your behaviour after? And perhaps more hauntingly, who is modelling theirs after you? Third wave experiment. In 1967, a high school history teacher named Ron Jones set out to demonstrate a lesson he feared students were not fully grasping. How could ordinary Germans accept and even support the rise of Nazism and fascism? Jones believed his students saw the Holocaust and Nazi Germany as distant, incomprehensible evils, acts of monstrous others, not a society like their own. So he created a live social experiment, which he called the Third Wave. What began as a simple classroom demonstration quickly spiraled into a full-blown movement. Jones told his students about discipline, order, and strength, introducing a strict set of rules. They formed a new group, the Third Wave, with its own salute, mottos, and rituals. Students were required to sit in strict rows, speak in unison, and adhere to rigid discipline. The teacher enforced conformity. Questioning was discouraged. Peer pressure mounted. Students were rewarded for loyalty and punished for dissent. Membership grew quickly, with many students embracing the sense of belonging, power, and purpose it gave them. Within days, the third wave had become a small but fervent cult, complete with surveillance and social policing. Students who resisted were ostracized. Privacy was sacrificed. Even Jones himself became alarmed as the experiment began to take on a life of its own. By the end of the week, Jones revealed the truth. The third wave was an experiment designed to show how easily people can be seduced by authoritarianism, how quickly fascism can take root, even among free, educated youth. The experiment shocked the participants and the world. It revealed how obedience, conformity, and social identity can override individual morality and critical thinking. When given structure, belonging, and a shared enemy, ordinary people can commit acts they would never imagine. The third wave remains one of the most powerful demonstrations of social psychology's dark side. It's a stark warning that totalitarianism isn't just the product of evil leaders, it's the product of willing followers. What these experiments say about you. The experiments we've explored today, whether in classrooms, labs, or secret government programs, are more than just historical footnotes. They are mirrors held up to humanity, reflecting truths that are as unsettling as they are important. But the most pressing question remains: what do these experiments say about you? Perhaps you see yourself as a good person, kind, moral, compassionate, and that is entirely possible. Most people want to believe they would never harm others, betray their values, or be complicit in cruelty. But these studies reveal the fragility of that self-image. They show that context matters more than character. In situations of stress, authority, group pressure, or fear, even the best among us can act in ways that betray our ideals. Consider the Good Samaritan study. It wasn't evil that stopped those seminary students from helping a stranger in need. It was a simple factor: being in a hurry. How many times have you rushed past someone because you told yourself, "I don't have time"? It's not malice, it's human limitation. Albert Bandura's Bobo doll experiment shows that behavior is learned and replicated. We absorb what we see, and sometimes without realizing it, that means we mimic aggression, cruelty, or indifference. What patterns have you absorbed from your environment? What models shape your reactions? The third wave experiment reveals the seductive power of belonging and authority. When surrounded by uniformity, purpose, and pressure, even intelligent people surrender autonomy. Have you ever conformed to groupthink, accepted a harmful norm just to fit in, denied your doubts because others around you did? These experiments do not condemn you. They warn you. They remind you that morality is not a fixed trait but a constant choice. The capacity for cruelty and kindness coexists within every person, and the greatest challenge is awareness, knowing your vulnerabilities, your blind spots, your moments of weakness. Because in the quiet moments when no one is watching, when pressures mount, when fear or convenience cloud judgment, that is when true character is tested. The fragility of morality. As we conclude this journey through some of psychology's most brutal experiments, one thing becomes clear: morality is fragile. It is not an unbreakable shield or a fixed attribute. It is a delicate, dynamic balance that can shift with context, circumstance, and pressure. The experiments we've discussed reveal that the capacity for evil is not reserved for monsters or villains. It exists in all of us. Sometimes it lurks beneath the surface, waiting for a trigger. Authority, anonymity, group pressure, fear, or stress. Stanley Milgram's obedience studies showed that ordinary people can deliver harm to others simply because an authority tells them to. The Stanford prison experiment showed how quickly power corrupts and dehumanizes. The Good Samaritan study reminded us how self-interest often overrides compassion. And the third wave experiment demonstrated how easily even educated youth can be drawn into fascism. But this fragility is also a source of hope. Because if morality is not fixed, it means it can be cultivated, strengthened, and protected. Through awareness, through reflection, through deliberate choice. It means that every day, in countless small moments, you have the power to resist cruelty, to choose kindness, courage, and empathy. It means that while the human mind is capable of darkness, it is also capable of light. The question is not whether evil exists within us. It does. The question is what you will do when that darkness stirs.